motivation of the Bolsheviks is that they are holding on to Germany. And that's something you mentioned, and so I wondered how you see that fitting in. The second is maybe a naive question, which comes from my history as somebody who is on the left and spent years reading Lenin and Trotsky and accepting a certain orthodoxy about these things. And then when you start sort of reading more broadly, it becomes clear that this is all very politicized. It becomes clear that some of it is in a kind of Cold War framework, and that some of it is still in that kind of political framework. It also becomes clear, I went to a meeting 2 or 3 weeks ago, it also becomes clear that there are a number of Russian academics who are descended from the Russian bourgeoisie who were dispossessed in 1917 themselves, and so their approach to everything is, or to be blunt, it does seem to be a bit motivated by what happened to Grandad, and the fact that the family was forced into exile, and so on, to put it a bit more seriously. But that does mean that they are quite hostile to the Bolsheviks, and so reading Russian history is partly a matter of sort of threading your way through those different influences. And I wondered if you thought that was correct, or how you would see that.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah.
Right, I was brought up in the old Workers' Revolutionary Party, and it's really very similar actually to the comrade behind me. When you said, well, maybe it was Lenin that retreated to socialism in one country because he spoke of a defensive position, that's not what Trotsky analysed, in the sense that did that then mean the abandonment of international perspective of revolution, which connects with what Comrade has said about waiting for Germany, that Lenin, as far as I understand, the Bolsheviks knew they were taking a terrific risk, and they decided, for what reason, to do it. So it was a fundamental international theoretical shift, as I was always taught.
Okay, so that's a question mark at the end?
Yeah.
Got it, okay, thanks. Should we take one more? Is there anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in what you were saying about the sort of the weakness of the Soviet state, the so-called Soviet state, up until World War II, and how it was really very ramshackle and so on. Yeah, that's very much the impression I get from stuff I've read about it elsewhere. But I think something that just an impression I get from lots of sources about the way the Soviet Union ran is that the way people tend to think about the Soviet state, not just from Cold War propaganda, but from all sorts of sources, is that it was this very sort of efficiently run sort of totalitarian monster. Yeah. But in reality, in a lot of ways, it was very weak, it was very inefficient, very incompetent to run. It was notoriously bad at imposing labour discipline, for example. But not just labour discipline, it was very notoriously easy to forge documents and stuff like that, and workers used to forge stamps in their internal passports and their workbooks and all this sort of thing. So I just wondered if you had any sort of further comments to make about the general question of sort of the weakness of the state or the ramshackle nature of it. I'd like to hear a bit about that.
Okay, do you want to take those?
Yeah,
That's
sure.
Quite a collection.
Well, a number of them are related happily, but I did mention that Lenin argued in Immediate Task that they should, if necessary, withdraw. That they should, if necessary, withdraw to the Urals. And that is hanging on for Germany. That is hanging on for world revolution. Stalin was no less enthusiastic about world revolution as a goal than anybody else in the Bolshevik Party, even in the 1930s and the 1940s. It's not a question of him abandoning world revolution. That's a complete, as I say, we have to de-Trotskyify our view of Stalin. No, I'm not saying Trotsky's wrong about everything, because it can be very misleading. So, what Lenin is saying is precisely what Stalin said. We do have to survive. That's the best we can do. until the world revolutionary situation turns around. And then we will... I mean, I'm pretty convinced. I mean, it's very difficult to know. I mean, Stalin's got a very dark side to his mind as well. And that area I don't think I can penetrate in the slightest. But he does seem to believe half the propagandist stuff about the workers of the world see the Soviet Union as a beacon. And that after World War II, they're going to set up popular fronts, win over the Europeans, and then establish communism. I think that to kind of, and I think Stalin's inspiration for this is that early so-called war communism period, which I think is a misnomer, because it gives the impression, and it was intended to give the impression, it was a temporary move away from socialist transformation to a more pragmatic set of policies which involved massive centralisation in order to fight the war. But in actual fact, I don't think, it seems to me that the war communism element the real, so many people in the party, like Stalin and others, and Trotsky at the time, thought that this was socialist transition, full stop. It was not war-driven socialist transition initially. NEP was the aberration, and many of the party faithful hated NEP. Trotsky hated NEP. That was where they went off the tracks. So war communism was not the aberration in the sense that it was purely a pragmatic response. That was deemed initially to be the how you would engage in transition. Now, transition is a massively difficult problem, and I don't want to minimise it. The problem, I mean, any revolutionary is going to face up to this. It's very easy to criticise the present. It's very easy to say what you want in the future. It's almost impossible to say what you want today and tomorrow, to link them together, and how you're going to actually achieve it, and how you're going to take the steps. So transition is a very important issue there. Serge does write very vividly about year one of the Russian Revolution, but of course he didn't get to Russia till year two. He wasn't there himself, and his memoirs are brilliant on when he's there as well. I think that's really important. Bias because people belong to the emigration. One of our good friends is Steve Kerensky. I think the name will probably give you a hint as to where he comes from. Who has spent the first 50 years of his life trying to pretend he wasn't Russian. The last 20 years of his life trying to resurrect the family honour, and I think he's done quite a good job in lots of ways, in his own very non-academic way. But I think it's. I don't think I would really want to. I mean, I'm not a determinist. I don't think if you're a bourgeois historian, you're always going to support the bourgeoisie. In fact, most left-wing historians are pretty bourgeois in themselves, aren't they? But you are right. I mean, you have to look for this kind of bias. I don't know how far should one go with this. The Western Cold War attitudes have been massively constructed by a small group of people who come from what Timothy Snyder calls the bloodlands, places which suffered from German invasion and Soviet invasion. Richard Pipes, for all his Anglo-Saxon sounding name, Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright, many others, Kissinger from background, have all come from that Central European thing, and they're marked by that experience. Yeah, they are. But I don't say that's necessarily a bias in itself, is it? I mean, it's certainly their reaction to their situation. And all of us are biased in our own ways, and we need to take that in mind. But I don't see, because you're in the emigration, that you're necessarily going to take a pro-emigre view and simply be worried about what happened to your grandfather. That's exactly what Steve Kerensky is worried about, and tries to not just by the Bolsheviks, of course, by the rest of the Russian emigration, because Kerensky was turned into the scapegoat by the rest of the emigration as the person who let the Bolsheviks into power. And the last scandal of his life was that the Russian Orthodox Church in America wouldn't allow him to be buried there. In Russian Orthodox soil, consecrated soil. He's buried at Putney Vale Cemetery here in London because of that, and he was a fugitive from everybody. So let me see. World revolution. I think we have talked about that. The weakness of the state. Well, this could go into all kinds of directions. I mean, I think the point that you made about people forging documents and passes. I mean, one of the most spectacular was Fitzroy Maclean, the Tory MP, who was in the British Embassy in Moscow in 1930, mid-30s. I think this episode was in 1936. The height of the purges and everything, where you thought things were most turned down. But he applied for permission to travel to Central Asia, to go to Xinjiang, if you read his memoirs. Because everyone is worried about what's going on in Xinjiang, because it was a kind of wild area of warlords, China, the fate of Japan, all the complexity. Xinjiang was a province where people knew very little but were worried about what was going on. So he applied to the authorities in Moscow through the normal channels and said, I want to go to Central Asia and beyond. And they said no. So he said, okay, fine. He went into the British Embassy, wrote himself out a pass, stamped it, and went. And waved it to any policemen and soldiers who came in his way. Because they didn't know what these damn documents were supposed to look like, did they? I mean, they'd never seen one before. And strength of personality and daring enabled Fitzroy Maclean to get to Xinjiang. And I mean, it's also. I mean, I think I don't want to be. It's very difficult. One of the most difficult problems of writing a biography of Stalin is you don't want to appear to be a Stalin apologist. But if you say the worst things about Stalin are not true, people will immediately call you a Stalinist. But it seemed to me that one of the areas which we need to think about Stalin is that the terrible nature of his crimes are as much crimes of criminal neglect as they are of intent. And that if you look at the horrors of the purges, so many examples of the fact that people were sent out. I mean, I put a few in my book. A story from one of the most impressive survivors of the camps, Eduardo Steiner, who was a Croatian communist, but he had 10,000 days in the camps and survived 20 years. But he has this story that was told to him by Joseph Berger of a group of prisoners and guards are taken to the end of the railway. They're force marched 200 or 300 miles into the wilderness. Many of them die on the way. They're supposed to build a camp themselves. They're supposed to begin to provide for themselves. There's supposed to be some supplies which were going to be brought in. They never arrive. Nobody knows. The communications are poor. When things get desperate, there's a parachute drop. But lots of people die. I mean, these people weren't meant to die, if you see what I mean. They died because the system was so appalling at dealing with the numbers of people that were in it. And it was a big revelation to me about 20 years ago, listening to a paper by a colleague, that they, I suppose, I don't want to trivialise this, but they had inspections of the camps. They had camp inspectors who went round to the camps and they sent in reports and said the conditions in the camps are dreadful. People are dying of starvation, the work quotas are completely wrong, something needs to be done here, but nothing was ever done because nobody's going to actually, particularly in the worst death years, 1941 of course was the biggest year of deaths in the camps. There's so much desperation in the whole of the Soviet Union at that time that people are not going to spare the resources to go to the camps. So a big multiplier of the scale of the horror of those camps comes from this simple fact that they were just so incredibly badly administered. Now, they're not, the Soviet Union didn't have any death camps. It had a lot of executions. You had about 800,000 executions. I'm not trying to gloss over any of this. And there's, of course, the famous example of the execution of Blochi, supposed to have killed 7,000 people by his own hand, including shooting the Katyn victims one by one in batches at night. Until in 1950, he survived the Stalin system. In 1954-55, de-Stalinization came about, and for whatever motivation you might fill in your own, I don't know what it was, but I could guess possible ones, he shot himself. What had appeared to be supposedly necessary now appeared to be totally unnecessary. And that is also, of course, one of the issues about Stalin's crimes. They are actually counterproductive. Some people used to argue Stalin succeeded because of the purges. He nearly failed because of the purges. Didn't nearly succeed because of the purges. No purges, the country would have been stronger. But so I think the weakness and the ramshackle nature of it is very important to take in as a dimension in the 20s and the 30s and in the revolution itself.
Okay, further questions? Okay, God, you first, yeah, with a tie.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your insightful, interesting speech. And it was really nice to hear your view about the causes of the October Revolution, why the Tsar was able to maintain power after the 1905 revolution, but failed to sustain his power and dominance over Russian society after the 1917 revolution. I wanted to ask a question about the actual occurrence of the revolution in a country like Russia. I was thinking, because the fact that communism in Russia was such a new concept, and the fact that Russia wasn't in a state of implementing communism, don't you think that it was a mistake or a betrayal or contradiction of Marxist ideology for communism to be implemented in Russia, given that Marx himself, in his book Communist Manifesto, specifically said that he predicted communism to be implemented in Europe's most advanced economies, Britain, France, Germany. And don't you think that it was this inherent structural flaw within Russian society that explains why communism failed to continue?
Okay, thanks very much. The young man behind you, did you have your hand up, sir?
I heard you mention Lenin's view on socialism.
Could you speak up a little bit? Sorry.
I heard you mention Lenin's view on socialism in one country, and yeah, so I was thinking about we know about the German Revolution, and I think it's called the Spartacus Revolution in Weimar Germany. I'm not quite sure when it was around 1921. I just wanted to ask, what was your view on Lenin's view of this, if you believe in socialism in one country after the rest of the treaty?
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, one more, yeah.
I'm struck by what you've said about the weakness of the weakness of the Bolsheviks, and it relates to the first question that was my friend over there asked. And I'm reflecting also on an article I read some time ago, so the dates are a bit blurred in my mind, but it seems to relate to this problem of continuity between Lenin and later. And the article is by Chris Goody, I think it is, in Critique. Mm-hmm. And what he's talking about is the attempt by the Bolsheviks, in particular Lenin, whose first work was state capitalism, development of state capitalism in Russia, I can't remember the full title. His attempt there was to introduce state capitalism. And he was putting this forward, and the masses thought, this is our opportunity to take over. So they took over, and this is a very brief version of his article, which I read 20 years ago. They took over, and immediately the banks that Lenin wanted to get the funds from to develop these big state monopolies refused to lend, because they were going to be lending to these large corporations run by workers. So that then pushes him back where exactly the problem that
friend, I think, is talking about there, a situation where he can't do the development that he thinks is necessary, that would then produce the conditions in which some kind of other social change is possible.
Okay, thanks very much.
I think that's what our friend Engels also said as well, in the nature of that quotation that I put at the end there. I mean, Lenin was very conscious of the fact that Russia was not a place where you could necessarily conduct and follow through a socialist revolution. And even as late as the 16th of October, when he's urging his party to act, to take power, he says we must act now in order to encourage the Germans. Yeah, maybe he does. That's what he thinks. It's in the advanced areas which initially which they expect a revolution to occur, and Russia certainly isn't one of them. And Lenin's whole career is, not whole career, but a very large aspect of his career is built constructing a particular Marxist view of why you should be a Marxist in Russia. Now, almost everybody on the left was Marxist in Russia. The socialist revolutionaries were Marxists, many of them, and their inspiration was Marxist. They had the advantage, in a sense, that a couple of them actually written to Marx about this very problem in 1879, 1880. And the reply had come that, yeah, it's possible you could have a revolution in Russia, but it must be sustained by a revolution in Western Europe eventually, or fairly quickly. And that this was before the working class, or before industrialization had really taken off in Russia. And in the last years of his life, Marx got interested in peasant socialism in Russia, because the SR's point of view, well, they weren't SR, so they were called populists, but their point of view was that Russia was intrinsically socialist because of the institutions of the peasant commune, and they didn't have private land ownership amongst the peasants, or individual private land ownership of the Western time, and so on and so forth. And that was, I mean, Lenin argued, and his point, one of his points in writing Development of Capitalism in Russia was not that he thought there was going to be state capitalism, it was that he wanted to tell the SRs that the idea that Russia could go directly from socialism, its present situation, to socialism without going through capitalism. Sorry, that was the question which the SRs had asked Marx in 1881. And Marx said, yes, they could afford capitalism. What development of capitalism in Russia is intended to do is to tell them, no chance. Capitalism is already here. It's not very developed, but we are now, capitalism is a developing mode of production in Russia. The other point about state capitalism and transition is very important too, because Chris Goody, I think he wrote, I can't remember the precise details, I read it as well about the same time as you were probably, seems maybe it was even earlier, but the first concept of transition which Lenin has is the one which comes in the April thesis, where he says, it is not our immediate task to introduce socialism. It's there, absolutely plain. A statement which I think has been so overlooked, but it's one of his, the April thesis is Lenin's most important statement of 1917, and it's simple. 10 Commandments, there they are, 2 pages. What more do you want? And that's what he says. We are not, it's not our immediate, what he means is we've got to prepare the ground. What we are going to introduce is Soviet supervision of production and distribution. That's what he says. Now what does that mean? It means he does talk about nationalising the banks. He didn't talk at that stage, and he does later on in the year, but at that stage he does not talk about nationalising anything else. So, what is he suggesting? Isn't he suggesting a politically overseen capitalist economy? One in which the same owner, he's not saying we should dispossess the owners now. We need them. We'll supervise them, bring them under control bit by bit. So you're going to have a kind of state capitalism, one sort of one sort of state-supervised capitalism. In the spring, immediate tasks moves even further to the state, because exactly what you said happens. The capitalists refuse to play the role allotted to them in this rather romantic scenario. They refuse to operate under Soviet supervision, and they sabotage their factories. They take they asset strip. They disappear. They go abroad. We all know the general problems which evolve out of that. So by spring, there are no more capitalists left. They've partly liquidated themselves, and that's where Lenin turns to state capitalism as the alternative to this. He doesn't want a direct worker capitalism. He's not seeing socialism as what exists. Socialism is what we are building. Socialism is what's going to exist in the future. So state capitalism, I think, is the correct term, not war communism. Yeah, definitely. Did that pick up the nuances or not?
Yeah.
Well, my question then was that it appeared to me that he failed to do that. But the part of the problem of continuity is that he failed to achieve what he set out to achieve in creating the state capital. Because he did the control over that system, you were saying about controlled work discipline, didn't occur at all.
Yeah, Lenin didn't live very long after the revolution, of course, and it was early days. We all know the Chou En-lai statement, don't we, about we can't judge the French Revolution, it's too early to tell. He did. I don't like to say everything in Russia fails. Everything in history ultimately fails. But we enjoy the successes while they go on. Lenin's success is in having created Bolshevik power and having maintained it. What he says, of course, in his final correspondence, his final articles, particularly where he reviews Sukhanov's marvellous diary of 1917, he says, well, our critics are telling us that we were premature, that we jumped in, and we didn't have the prerequisites for the building of socialism in Russia. If you want to have a look at our revolution and on cooperation, two short last articles of Lenin's, which are crucial to this argument, you probably know them anyway. But he says, what better prerequisite could we have than controlling the state and having state power? We can then use that to create the other prerequisites of socialism, if you like. So you end up with this rather, I don't know how you'd want to interpret it, but you end up with the Leninist state trying to create the conditions which should have brought it into existence. And Soviet history is all about that, to me. Constantly trying to create the preconditions in different forms, different ways, that should have brought it into power, but didn't, because they weren't there originally. Trying to build up a working class, trying to build up industry, trying to restrict the peasants, trying to replace the peasants with the working class. And we've all seen the mess. I'm not saying it would necessarily had to turn out the way it did. It didn't have to turn out Stalinist, but it did. And I think the roots of that is precisely because there they were trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, in a sense. And you mentioned Lenin was kind of carried away by left-wing enthusiasm and overwhelmed by enthusiasm. Was that one of the points that Goody made?
Yeah, in a sense, bear with me. I read this ages ago.
Could you speak up a bit?
Oh, sorry. Bear with me. I read this ages ago, but the impression that I carry with me is that workers took this to mean what he was proposing, that they were now going to be in control.
Oh, well, yes,
and that's
certainly.
been part of the process of the capitalists disappearing as well.
Well, what they thought they were getting was peace, bread and land.
Yeah.
And they didn't get any of them. Well, the peasants got the land, but they said that they got it taken off them in 1929. So yeah, I mean they did expect certain things, and of course workers' control was something which they expected. Politically, what they most seem to have expected in 1917 was multi-party Soviet democracy, not one-party Soviet democracy. And that, I mean, I don't know whether Lenin could be said to have been carried away by the masses. I think it was really that he was horrified, and that he controlled it. And I don't know if you've ever read the story. What's the story of that First World War, Second World War story about the life and times of Private Ivan Chonkin? I can't remember who wrote it. Voinovich, thank you very much. There's a wonderful story there where a German plane crashes near an out-of-the-way village, and all the people get together around it and start wondering what they're supposed to do. And the party secretary gets on the blower to the regional party secretary, and he says, "What are we supposed to do? The people have gathered. They've got a meeting. What am I supposed to?" People have gathered spontaneously. Yeah. Well, the first thing you do is disperse them. So he disperses them, and he gets onto the party secretary, picks up the phone, dials him up. He says, "Right, I've dispersed them. What do I do now?" He says, "Call a meeting."
Very good.
That's Leninism in a nutshell. If it's spontaneous, I don't like it. Sorry.
So some, yeah, and then time again.
Oh, there's somebody on the back.
That struck me about Lenin's writings in 1917 was that they sort of become a little bit lively rather than his rather schoolmasterist sort of prose. And that to me seems that he's seeing workers taking control of factories. He's seeing all these things. And he's saying, yeah, this is good. This is something we'd not expected. This is something that hadn't appeared, except momentarily in 1905. And he's he perks up a lot. By the end of the year, you start to see the other side of the class. You see the drunkenness, the lack of discipline amongst other parts of the world. Therefore, you see a shift towards the paternalism of the political tradition in which he grew up, the Second International. Because after all, the Bolsheviks were part of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, part of the Second International, which had a rather paternalistic attitude towards the world. He modelled his party, he wanted to model it on the German Socialist Party, which was very paternalistic. And therefore, you had that. I think in 1917, you actually saw Lenin sort of becoming, I wouldn't say libertarian, that's not the right word exactly, but he was actually seeing the working class in action, only briefly. And then you see the reversion to paternalism, towards the emphasis more and more on the party. Now, if you've seized power as a class, what you need is therefore a party if the class is actually ruling. So if you've got more emphasis on the party, it shows that something is going deeply wrong. And the emphasis from workers' control to statification seems to be almost like an unconscious reflection of the revolution sort of seizing up. And initiative is kind of bottled in, it peters out, and has to be replaced by something else. But coming to the question of the political monopoly, is that, well, and the multi-party idea of a council regime, I thought it was the Bolsheviks were, along with the left of the SRs, the only parties that really recommended this. So you could see how, once they set up a party, a council-based regime, the parties that didn't support that really excluded themselves from it. And then the left SRs went into revolt against the council-based government with the over-breasted toss. It actually had an armed uprising against it. I'm not trying to say it was a good thing to set up a political formula, but it's to see it as some kind of almost teleological process that in there within Bolshevism is a bit kind of, I'm afraid, a bit Cold Warish, or the mirror image, the Stalinist image of what happened, rather than the Bolsheviks sort of trying to deal with what was unprecedented situation, both within Russia itself and also taking power in a place which was really not suited for a council regime, except within the concept of a European-wide revolution.
Okay.
There's a
next.
question in the back.
Yeah, back there. Yeah.
I was interested that we came earlier about the Civil War saved the Bolsheviks. I wondered if you could elaborate on that. And I also wanted to know to what extent you think 1917 and other communist revolutions of the 20th century affect social change now and shape the world we live in.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Right, there's more questions.
Can we just deal
Do you
with what
want
we
to
got?
deal with the ones you've got?
Okay, yeah, I should
Okay,
forget
then
what
we'll
I
come
should
back
get
to
these.
you,
There's
okay.
some very important points being raised there,
Yeah.
and they're very, very significant. Now, my view of the Bolsheviks and multi-party democracy don't come from the Cold War, they come from Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg, in her a very important pamphlet on the Russian Revolution, said, if you don't allow freedom of expression, and you don't allow openness in an election, all life's going to die out in the party. That was actually very prophetic, considering I don't know how on earth she knew what was going on, and she died, of course, before much of this had developed. But if you look in the first week of Bolshevik power at the Central Committee minutes, of course, 5, 6, 7, 8 members of the government already resigned because Lenin won't engage in alliance politics with anybody else. Lenin's the one who stops it. I have absolutely no doubt Lenin does not want to share power with any other party. And it's not a question of him being, as it were, the last one standing when everybody else falls away. Now, I agree that the Menshevik boycott of the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was stupid. I think many boycotts are pretty stupid from their own point of view. Just leave you've got to be pretty desperate to just leave the floor to the enemy. And that's what they did, rather than stand and fight. And I think that was probably a mistake. But I don't see, Lenin, at no point, it's difficult enough Lenin doesn't particularly like factions within his party, let alone factions related to other parties. And in 1921 he stamps down on factionalism within the party itself. Now, you may say that's because you have to, but he was very, if you look at the long trail of former associates of Lenin, Bogdanov, Martov, a good friend of his, and so on and so forth. Trotsky was one of his enemy. Trotsky comes back because their views begin to converge. Yeah, Lenin will overcome that, but Lenin will only deal with people if they're on his own terms, in my view. So I don't particularly sympathise with that view, but I can see. I think I see what we're trying to say there. Now I seem to remember that the question at the back there is going to take till midnight to answer. But what was the point? The key points that you wanted me to?
One, the Civil War.
The Civil War, yes. Sorry, yeah. Okay, yeah. The Civil War, yes. I think I can deal with the first one more simply than the second. I think the Civil War created a new form of polarisation, in which the whites were not really up to. If you look at the list of people the Bolsheviks were against, they were against the old ruling classes, the landowners, the church, the factory owners, the bankers. It was up against the British, the French, German occupiers for a while, Austrian occupiers for a while, Turks, Japanese, American occupiers. You say this looks a terrible list, but none of those was actually very determined, and they're all quite small, and none of them was particularly threatening. And the whites did not have a single policy which could actually bring, the whites only controlled the ground on which their armies tended to stand. When they advanced, they lost all the hinterland. Their politics just wouldn't have stood up to it. But it does create a bogeyman, and when the whites moved into a region, suddenly people became red. They started looking to the Reds more actively for support, even though they were not terribly keen in many cases on aspects. I mean, the peasants hated forced requisitioning of grain from the early 1918 onwards. But given a choice between forced requisitioning and handing the land back, they would always choose the people who were doing the forced requisitioning reluctantly. And what happens, I think, is that in the guise of fighting, I think that the Bolsheviks, that the situation was unravelling fast in 1918. You mentioned the collapse of the alliance with the left SRs, the left SR uprising, the Bolsheviks, the attempt to shoot Lenin in August 1918, the beginnings of terror on a bigger scale. The signs were there that things were getting very, very desperate. And we can't rewrite history, we can't have alternatives, but it seems to me the Bolsheviks would have been very lucky to survive 1918 without the Civil War springing up, to give them a cause, to give them a focus, and also to use that war for their own internal transformations of the red areas, to get control of workers' movements, to stop workers' control, to build up the party, to build up the Cheka, to build up one-party Soviets, to take over. They do this under the guise of fighting the Civil War. And when the Civil War's over, they don't go back on any of it. They make it stronger. They push it in 1920s. Political control becomes greater from 1921 onwards, not less, because they've already got the power to do that. And it's driven by the things I was talking about, their kind of fundamentalist view of having the truth. And of course, you may of course know that the Russian term for orthodoxy, the religion, official church is pravoslavia, which means praise of truth. I don't want to make deep cultural comparisons here, but praise of truth is what Lenin wanted. He didn't want argument about it, and it also creates a situation where people who don't praise truth are heretics. And Lenin was forever condemning people who disagreed with him to being heretics, and very rarely adopted their ideas. As for the worldwide significance of the revolution, well, I think one point which I would like to say is that it seems to me that the Russian Revolution was a tragedy, not of the kind that certain historians, ghosts may be walking these very corridors, might say. But the idea that what the revolution was a fantastic explosion of popular creativity, of popular political creativity, of institutional creativity, of factory committees. This is what's been emphasised, I think, by the previous speakers. It's just unbelievable how many people participated, how spontaneously they built up factory committees, peasant committees, soldiers' committees, and they were all desperately trying to control their own lives. And they thought the Bolsheviks were the people to do it. Why? Because everybody else was sucked into the provisional government who was trying to stop this process eventually. The Bolsheviks were left to say, yeah, we'll support peace, bread and land. And that's one of the brilliant points Sukhanov makes. He said, yeah, the Bolsheviks, I agreed with everything they said, but I didn't trust them to carry it out. What they meant by peace was civil war, because they said there was going to be a civil war, the one that ended in April, not the one that continued. That they would not be able to deliver bread because another round of disruption would create a greater, not a lesser economic crisis. And to think that the Bolsheviks wanted to hand land to the peasants was to go back on to the very essence of Bolshevik existence, which is to deny the socialist revolutionaries' policy, which was exactly that. Even though Lenin seizes that policy in October 1917 and makes it the Bolsheviks' own, until they're in power and they take it back again. Would Lenin have supported Stalin in 1929? Of course, you'd say Lenin, it was a complete breach with Lenin's view that there should be an alliance between peasant and worker, the Swichka. But that was because the peasants had defeated the revolution ultimately in 1921. They had forced this second transition into failure. And the NEP had created a third transition, which Lenin felt was necessary. Had he thought it was possible to get away with smashing the peasants, would he have disagreed with Stalin? Because after all, that's what Lenin initially tried to do. To break the peasantry and to build a more socialist form of peasant revolution. So, it's not that clear cut to me. So I think there's a lot to look back positively in the revolution, but the tragedy is that it threw up a leadership which was out of sympathy with the objectives of the people who conducted the revolution, and that was the contradiction that began to work itself out for me through the Civil War and afterwards.
Thanks very much. There were a couple more questions at the back, I think. Yes. Okay, 1, 2, and then 3. Okay, then maybe give Chris a break after those 3. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned about how a revolution in Russia should have been followed by a revolution in like Western Europe. Do you think if Trotsky won the power struggle when Lenin died, do you think he would have implemented international revolution? So do you think he would have been different in a dictatorship rather than Stalin, or do you think that he would have inevitably gone the same course as Stalin did? And also, as Trotsky was religious himself, do you think that he would have been so harsh on religious communities like Orthodox religion and Islam and Judaism?
I don't know where you get Trotsky being sympathetic to religion from. That's not the Trotsky I've ever read or looked at. He's very, very hostile to it. In fact,
I thought as he was Jewish himself, he might be less
no. It's like saying that Lenin is Christian and he's going to be less harsh on Christians. No, not at all. I think they're both very, very harsh. And I think there's something here which I think is an interesting point, because Lenin bangs on about religion as the opium of the people, but he forgets the quotation from Marx which that comes from. Religion is the heart of a heartless world. It's the soul of a soulless universe. It's the opium of the people. Marx meant religion was consolation in the tough, harsh world of capitalism. Whereas Lenin says, it's just a drug which befuddles people's minds. We've got not the same subtlety about it at all. And there's a whole cultural bridge of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, because the church was so deeply involved in the autocracy that it's not surprising that to be a revolutionary in Russia was to be severely anti-clerical and to be anti-religious, because the church had kind of, or aspects of the church had prostituted itself, supported anti-Semitism, and so on and so forth, in support of the autocracy. So if you oppose the autocracy, you oppose the Orthodox Church. And some people in the Orthodox Church were trying to do something about that, but they hadn't got very far by 1905 or 1917. It's another thing which I annoy people by saying, but I think possibly Trotsky would have been harsher than Stalin. He was far more determined. He was far more ideologically driven. He was far less pragmatic. He was far surer of his position, and he certainly was ruthless, personally and politically, in the Civil War period. In the famous episodes with his shooting soldiers and deserters on the spot, and also with his desire to militarise labour and push the idea of the militarisation of labour several times in the period 1918, 1920. He believed in a much stronger, firmer central grip over revolution, in my point of view, than even Stalin. So I don't see that Trotsky was going to be it certainly wasn't going to follow. There's no inevitability about Stalinism. There's no inevitable path, as I think you mentioned. I'm not going to say he's going to do the same thing at all. But Trotsky hated peasants even more than Stalin did, and believed that they were going to be the force which would destroy the revolution. But you're right, he was an internationalist, and perhaps had he had his way and refused to sign Brest-Litovsk on internationalist grounds, what would have happened then? Would the system have collapsed even earlier in 1918 than I suggested? If they'd put all their eggs into the basket of world revolution and revolutionary war, as the left the left communists and Trotsky tended to support, we don't know what the outcome of that would have been, but it seems unlikely that it would have been any more successful than, well, I won't make any comparisons of the 1920s, the situation was different. But I don't think necessarily that a revolutionary war would have swept into Western Europe in early 1918. And it might have done what Lenin feared it would do, completely destabilise the Bolshevik government and destroy it.
Okay, we've got one more at the back, and then Simon.
Earlier on in the lecture you mentioned that the Bolsheviks were a minority party. I just wanted to please clarify that, because I heard that the social revolutionary split at one point, and that made them less sizable than the Bolsheviks. And even if the social revolutionary split wasn't half and half, I reckon I'm sure that all parties would have been more pluralist. I don't think one party would have dominated the scale. I don't know. I just wanted to get your view on that.
Okay, thanks.
In going back to the conversation earlier about state capitalism, or whatever it was that developed under the aegis of the Soviet government, what I find really depressing about the politics of Bolshevism is that there's a group formed of Red Army soldiers who come back from the Civil War, and they're in the communist universities, and some of these young people decide to form this thing called Workers' Truth, which is interesting going back to that point, and they issue these leaflets saying we're condemned to a period when the country is going to be ruled by a technical bureaucracy, and in that period we can expect something like capitalism to prevail in our country, and what we've got to do is build up the socialist elements within that. And what's depressing to me is that these are people who are clearly trying to sort of think their way through this mess, and the response of the leadership is the kind of standard one which you can guess, which is that there's arrests, there's people get sacked from their jobs, they're sent outside of Moscow where they're all together so that they're separated, and there's just no engagement. And I'm sure there are many other examples, but that seems to me a particularly poignant one, because they're trying very hard to kind of get to grips with these problems, which we're still trying to get to grips with many years later. My question to you, Chris, is you've talked about a non-Bolshevik and probably non-SR and non-Menshevik working class politics, and that was what I researched when I was doing my research on the 1920s, and I think I can see that it was there in 1917, and you've mentioned the demand, the hope, which you can even see on the banners in these photographs, for multi-party Soviet democracy. That comes up again in Kronstadt. There's an incredible book by Jeffrey Brooks, I think it is, about the workers' movements in 1928-29, where he's found that there are, again, similar slogans are coming up at that time. I mean, from your point of view, to what extent can we see a politics which might be very different and itself very kind of heterogeneous, which is a working class politics as distinct from a workers' party politics, and could that have gone anywhere, or was it doomed by these events inevitably to be squashed as it was, in the way that I've given the example in 1921-22, from any kind of open existence?
Well, electoral mathematics based on the Constituent Assembly elections is an interesting game. We do know that the Bolsheviks got 25% themselves, What proportion of the rest of the SRs were left SRs? Of course, Lenin said that's why we've got to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly delegates, of course, had refused to go along with Lenin's what they wanted the Constituent Assembly to do, which is simply to basically rubber stamp the Soviet system, as it then was up to that point. The delegates to the Constituent Assembly certainly weren't a majority in favour of Lenin and Leninism. They were the ones elected by these people, so I guess they should have reflected them to some extent. To manufacture a 51% majority, a Brexit majority in Lenin's favour out of the Constituent Assembly might or might not be possible. But it's certainly the case that, I mean, even those people who consider themselves to be Bolsheviks in those early months had little concept of what Leninism meant in the deeper objectives that I was talking about of socialist construction. It always puzzled me. I mean, in his so-called letter to the Congress, where he depicts the faults, mainly faults, of all the other leaders of the party. He says, well, Bukharin's the darling of the party, but I doubt if even he understood dialectical materialism. So if even bloody Bukharin didn't understand it, how would any other party member know what the hell was going on? And when they produced the party programme as a kind of the ABC of communism, as a kind of catechism to sell the idea to the Bolshevik party itself of what the hell they were supposed to be believing in. This is all part of this whole consciousness raising issue. So Bolsheviks, I don't think one can seriously say that they were anything other than a minority. They felt justified in being a minority because they saw themselves as being advanced. Now, there was a question earlier which I forgot to mention, the point here about workers and Lenin and the working class and his relationship to it before the points which Simon made, but and Lenin getting excited about 1917. Sure, I mean, if you're a revolutionary, you don't get excited about 1917. There's something wrong with you. But Lenin's very cautious about the revolutionary potential of the Russian working class. He describes them as backward almost all the way, and even in the April thesis, well, not even in the April thesis, he says, well, you know, they're under the thrall of the imperialist defensists, revolutionary defensists. We've got to have careful, patient explanation to them of what the true ideals are. He refers to them as backward on numerous occasions in 1917. This is a term which Lenin uses. They're not the advanced working class of Marxism, and he knows it. So I don't think he's over enthusiastic about workers being so creative. He's very enthusiastic about workers who agree with him, and I think that's how he tends to define the Bolsheviks. Could it have been different? Well, all I can say is I'd like to think it could have been that 1917, that the Bolshevik takeover in the form that it has didn't necessarily have to be what it was. There's been a confluence of Cold War views, which I think we touched upon before, that both Leninists, Soviet official Leninists, Stalinists, whatever you want to call them, emphasised the role of the party, of Lenin, of leadership, of discipline, of taking power, of the party's role in 1917, but so does the Cold War view. They do exactly the same, but say it was a kind of evil thing. If you take the view that the party didn't seize power, but just picked it up in October 1917, if the Bolsheviks had done nothing in October, if they'd disappeared from the face of the earth, Soviet power was going to be declared anyway, because the majority of delegates to the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, who were not a majority of Bolsheviks, were mandated to declare Soviet power anyway on the 25th, 26th of October, assuming that the provisional government had failed in its attempt to stop them from meeting, because the provisional government knew this was the case. So as I think I mentioned, Sartre Soviets, Soviet power was not the Bolsheviks' gift to the Russian working class, it was the Russian working class's gift to the Bolsheviks. and they took it from there and they made it their own. And as I also mentioned there, day one of the October Revolution is day one of the decline of the Soviets. And the Soviets become rubber stamps, essentially, within a year. And there's very little opportunity for them to become the open fora that was so admirable in 1917.
Okay, Chris, I think probably we're drawing to a close. Are there any last comments that you'd like to make or any thoughts to leave people with?
Well, great discussion, great questions. I enjoyed talking about it, and I think it does. I mean, I think there is a. I said there was no sign of revolutionary celebrations in Moscow being prepared, and talking to intellectuals, university people there. It was a conference on the revolution that I was there to take part in. They hadn't got a clue what the official celebrations were going to look like. Some people have argued Putin is trying to turn it into a festival of national unity. How you turn a revolution into a festival of national unity is perhaps even beyond Putin. But to show that that revolutions are nasty things, because he doesn't actually want one in the near future. If I was going to celebrate, I think we should celebrate 1917. I mean, there is the issue of the massive popular movement which went on, and I think is admirable. I mean, I made this point at the big national conference here in this country in Cambridge a couple of weeks ago, and somebody came to me after and said, "This is terrible. You know, we don't like to see people out of control. We don't want to see people running around the streets. We don't want to see demonstrators. This is the collapse of civilization as we know it. This is not something to be admired." And there is a kind of line, but I think that this audience is going to take a different view of that. I think, I would hope, and that there is a lot there to admire. But I also raise a question. I mean, there's a kind of assumption in the mainstream, and perhaps a bit more on the right than on the left, I don't know, that the Bolshevik Revolution is certainly very strong in Russia. The Bolsheviks ruined Russia, or the Russian Revolution ruined Russia. Now, is that true? Or did Russia ruin the Russian Revolution? Is it the traditional forces of Russia which bore down on the revolution and stopped it developing? You can make out a case for it the other way around just as readily, just as easily, in my view. So I think there's a lot. Also, I mean, for all its faults, the Soviet Union kept us out of the kind of lunacies we're in at the moment. The Cold War would not have, even the Cold War at its worst, would have made it difficult for the emergence of the forces that we're trying to deal with at the moment, and the dreadful international situation that we've got, and the outcome of which, I mean, God knows what it is. I mean, everybody's lost control now, haven't they? There is no semblance of international control over anything. It seems to me that the Cold War, is it a coincidence that neoliberalism has really roared ahead once the Soviet Union collapsed? Now, the Soviet Union was no example to anybody particularly, but the Soviet Union was the world's first and most extensive welfare state. It brought in the concept of social rights, which liberal countries still do not accept in the sense in which they were initially intended. There was a degree of competition after 1945 for fear of communism and its more attractive social policies to bring in the welfare state in places like Britain and in Europe, and to be now that the Soviet Union is gone and that's no longer a risk, and there's nobody on the left. Sorry, there's none of us on the left powerful enough to challenge anywhere today. They're running roughshod over what's left of the welfare state. Mm-hmm. For me, the next election's not about bloody Brexit; it's about the NHS, because if it goes the wrong way, if they have 5 more years of public spending slashing, the Britain that we're going to get in 5 years' time is going to be very different from what it is at the moment. Anyway, that's a little bit off the topic.
Thank you.
That's okay.